Humans have been cutting into each other for thousands of years long, before modern medicine. But how exactly did ancient surgeons slice open the human body without anesthesia? If you think the answer is just, they bit down on a piece of leather and endured it. You are dead wrong. The answer is far stranger than you'd think. And some of those early methods were almost as dangerous as the surgery itself. Today, we take a painless surgery as a given. You go into a bright, sterile room, breathe into a mask, count backwards from 10, and wake up when it's all over. We treat anesthesia like an undeniable right, but for the vast majority of human history, people didn't have that luxury. When facing a shattered bone or a deadly infection, ancient patients were backed into a terrifying corner. They believed survival depended on three things: brute strength to endure the agony, a surgeon who could cut with blinding speed, and relying on whatever natural concoctions they could forage to blur their waking minds. It's easy to look back and assume they simply accepted the raw brutality of the blade. For centuries, surgeons had to work with almost nothing. But then, they discovered something that changed everything. Long before modern chemistry, early healers looked to the earth for mercy. In ancient Greece and medieval Europe, they didn't have chemical drips. They had opium poppies and mandrake roots. Imagine lying on a wooden table, completely terrified. The surgeon doesn't tell you to count backward. Instead, he presses a coarse sea sponge against your face, the infamous soporific sponge, soaked in a potent brew of henbane, opium, and mandrake juice. You breathe in the heavy, pungent fumes. The world starts to spin. The edges of reality blur, and your limbs feel like lead. In other cultures, healers forced patients to consume massive amounts of alcohol or inhale thick cannabis smoke just to detach their minds from the impending trauma. They actively found ways to alter human consciousness. But there was one huge problem. These weren't true anesthetics in the modern sense. You see, those early healers didn't understand the central nervous system the way neurologists do today. They didn't know how electrical pain signals traveled from a sliced nerve ending up into the brain. But they were incredibly observant. They noticed that when a patient consumed a toxic cocktail of henbane or opium, they didn't actually fall into a deep, peaceful sleep. Instead, the patient just reacted slower. They struggled less against the surgeon's tight grip. They mumbled incoherently. And most importantly, the drugs created a mental haze that helped them forget the absolute worst of the agony. After the ordeal was over, think of it this way. These ancient brews didn't magically switch the pain off. It wasn't a clean break. It just turned the volume down. It was like pulling the emergency brake on a speeding train halfway. It slowed the terror down. But the train was still moving, and the impact was still going to hurt. But that was only the beginning. The real story is even darker. When herbal brews weren't enough, early surgeons resorted to sheer physical brutality, and this is the part almost nobody talks about. If a patient was facing a major amputation, the anesthesia was often a traumatic injury of its own. Physicians would intentionally compress the carotid arteries in a patient's neck, strangling them just long enough to cut off blood flow to the brain and induce a sudden, oxygen-deprived blackout. Some even delivered a calculated, heavy blow to the jaw to knock the patient completely unconscious. When force wasn't used, toxic excess was. Surgeons administered massive, near-lethal doses of alcohol, strapped the terrified patient down, and operated with frantic, terrifying speed before they snapped back to reality. But it was a deadly gamble. The cost of this desperation was absolute horror. Countless patients didn't die from the surgical blade. They died from severe alcohol poisoning, lethal botanical overdoses, or brain damage. The very thing meant to save them from pain was often what killed them. The biggest breakthrough, however, was not a drug. It was control. Before the mid-19th century, surgery was little more than a frantic race against shock and unimaginable fear. It was essentially organized torture. But when true chemical anesthetics, like ether, finally emerged, the entire medical world shifted. Medicine finally found a way to plunge a patient into a deep, controlled, and reversible state of unconsciousness safely. It was the difference between violently breaking into a house and simply opening a door with a key for the very first time in human history. Surgeons didn't have to rush. They could slow down, breathe, think, and actually operate. It transformed surgery from brutal butchery into an exact science. But here's the real question. What did that mean for the person lying on the table? Have you ever stopped to think that just over a century ago, a simple broken bone or a minor infection was a literal nightmare? You live in a world where pain is an option. You live in an era where surgery can be meticulously precise and where specialists monitor your every breath. But for thousands of years, people exactly like you had to choose between unspeakable agony, life-threatening danger, and certain death. They didn't have the luxury of closing their eyes and waking up healed. They lived in a world where survival itself was the anesthesia, where the sheer, primal desperation to live was the only thing getting them through the ordeal. That completely changes the way you see modern medicine, doesn't it? And once you see that, the past stops feeling distant. The story of ancient surgery isn't just a fascinating chapter in medical history. It is something much deeper. It is the history of human suffering, of unyielding courage, and of absolute, raw desperation, long before we possessed the science to truly understand what pain was. Humanity fought relentlessly to escape it. We pushed the limits of the human body, consuming poisons and enduring sheer brutality, all for a fleeting chance to see tomorrow. When you look back at those dark, agonizing rooms, you don't just see primitive medicine, you see the incredible resilience of the human spirit. They didn't have safe anesthesia. They had urgency, courage, and desperation. Modern medicine didn't erase pain. It finally learned how to respect it. The past is always stranger, and much darker, than fiction. If you want to uncover more hidden history like this, subscribe for the next one.